The sun had just begun to sink behind the hills when the cattle auction in Dry Creek reached its peak. The air was heavy with the smell of sweat, dust, and old leather, while men shouted bids and slapped their hats against their legs. At the center of it all stood Caleb Morton, a rich rancher whose money and pride were matched only by his arrogance. He had already outbid half the town on 3 prime bulls, and now he leaned back in his chair, sipping whiskey, as though he owned not just the livestock, but the men bidding on them too. As the night wore on, Caleb's companions, other ranchers, gamblers, and drifters, gathered around him at the corner table. The whiskey loosened their tongues, and soon the talk turned from cattle to gossip, from deals to dares. Someone mentioned her, the widow. Every man at that table turned their heads slightly, careful not to look directly toward the back of the room, where she always sat in silence. She was impossible to ignore. Nearly a head taller than most men, dressed in a long black dress that swallowed her shape, and a thick black wig that curled down past her shoulders. One of the men snorted and muttered, "Bet no man here has the guts to spend a night with her." The table erupted in nervous laughter. Everyone knew the rumors, that she had buried 3 husbands, that strange noises came from her mansion at night, that some swore her shadow stretched the wrong way under the moon. It was the kind of talk that men only dared whisper after 2 or 3 drinks. Yet Caleb leaned forward, his eyes narrowing with the challenge. "You boys are scared of a woman in black?" He jeered, slamming his whiskey glass down. "She's just flesh and blood like anyone else. Hell, I'll prove it." The table fell quiet for a moment, the silence broken only by the auctioneer's hammer striking wood. Then one of the older men grinned, his teeth yellowed. "Prove it, Morton. Go home with her tonight. Spend the night in her house. If you do, we'll call you the bravest man in Dry Creek." The challenge hung in the air like smoke. Caleb, driven by pride and the thrill of outdoing every man in the room, raised his chin and smirked. "Done," he said. "I'll have her wrapped around me before dawn. And when I come back, you'll all know I ain't afraid of ghost stories." His friends laughed uneasily, but none of them noticed the figure in the back, the giant widow herself, tilting her veiled head ever so slightly in Caleb's direction. The giant widow had lived in Dry Creek for years, yet almost no one claimed to know her by her first name. To the townsfolk, she was simply the widow, a towering shadow who drifted silently through auctions, funerals, and the dusty aisles of the general store. She rarely spoke, and when she did, her voice carried an uncanny weight, low and deliberate, as if each word was chosen with care. Children whispered that she could see through walls, that her eyes never blinked beneath the black veil. Adults didn't deny it. They only lowered their voices when her name came up. Her past was a puzzle pieced together through rumor and fear. Some swore she had once been married to a rancher from the north, a man who vanished without a trace after only 6 months. Another said she had taken a second husband, a traveling merchant who was found dead in his wagon, pale as though all the blood had been drained from him. The third story was even darker. A local sheriff who married her in secret, only to die 1 week later, his body discovered in the creek with no wounds, no struggle, just an expression frozen in horror. Each tale shifted in detail, depending on who told it, but the pattern remained the same. Men entered her life, and soon after, they were gone. Her appearance only fueled the fear. Standing nearly a head taller than most women, and even many men, she seemed more statue than human. Her gloved hands were large, her long black dress always trailing dust, as if it had been worn too many years without ever being washed. But it was her wig, that heavy crown of black curls, that drew the most whispers. Some claimed they'd seen it slip in the wind, revealing not hair beneath, but pale gleaming skin, unnatural in color. No one dared confirm it. No one dared get close enough to look twice. Yet there were others who believed the widow wasn't dangerous at all, that she was cursed. They whispered that her husbands hadn't been victims, but sacrifices, and that she lived alone in her crumbling mansion because she carried a burden too terrible to share. These softer voices were quickly drowned out by the more sinister theories that she had made a pact with something not of this world, that her wealth came from old blood money, and that she had to keep feeding whatever dark secret she guarded. By the time Caleb Morton laughed off the warnings, the widow had become more legend than woman. Every man in town claimed they wouldn't touch her with a 10-foot pole, yet none of them could take their eyes off her when she appeared. She was a riddle in black, a question nobody wanted answered. And that night, as the challenge passed Caleb's lips, it felt to the others as if he hadn't just accepted a bet. He had stepped directly into a story the town itself was too afraid to finish. The auction had ended, and the crowd slowly spilled into the cool night, boots scraping against the dirt road as men counted their winnings and losses. Caleb, half drunk with whiskey and pride, swaggered out of the hall with his friends trailing behind him. Laughter echoed, bets were repeated, and promises of bragging rights filled the air. But when the chatter died down, Caleb noticed something strange. The widow had not left with the rest of the crowd. She stood at the far end of the street, her veil glinting faintly in the lantern light, still as a statue, her gaze locked on him. The rancher smirked and straightened his coat, deciding to put on a show. "Watch this, boys," he muttered, striding toward her. The widow did not move until he was just a few steps away. Then, with a slowness that sent a ripple through the onlookers, she lifted her hand, long fingers gloved in black, and crooked it ever so slightly. An invitation. The men behind Caleb muttered under their breath, some urging him to walk away, others daring him to continue. Caleb, too proud to retreat, tipped his hat and said with a drunken charm, "Evening, ma'am. Mighty fine night, isn't it?" Her reply was nothing like he expected. Her voice was deep, carrying a strange echo that seemed too large for her body. "If you have such courage, rancher, come." She did not wait for an answer, but turned and began to walk down the lonely road that led out of town. Her steps were soundless, her tall frame gliding as if the earth bent itself to her will. Caleb stood frozen for a moment, caught between fear and the weight of his own reputation. The men behind him whispered furiously, some swearing he shouldn't go, others reminding him of the bet. Caleb's pride won. He mounted his horse, the leather saddle creaking as he adjusted himself, and followed her into the night. The widow walked ahead, never looking back, her black dress dragging across the dirt, untouched by dust. The further they rode, the quieter the world became. The hum of insects faded. The wind itself seemed to die. Even the hooves of Caleb's horse fell strangely muffled on the road, as if the earth did not wish to make a sound in her presence. When the outline of her mansion finally came into view, Caleb's smirk faltered for the first time that evening. It loomed against the horizon, a crumbling 2-story house, half swallowed by weeds and shadow. Its windows were dark holes, and the porch sagged as though it bore too much weight from secrets buried inside. The widow stopped at the gates, turning slowly, her face hidden beneath the veil. "Enter," she whispered, her hand sweeping toward the darkened home. Caleb swallowed, forcing himself to grin as his heart thudded hard against his ribs. The bet had led him here, but the night was far from over. The iron gates groaned as Caleb pushed them open, their hinges screaming like something alive. His horse balked, ears pinned back, refusing to cross the threshold of the widow's land. No amount of tugging on the reins would move it forward. With a curse under his breath, Caleb dismounted, slapped the animal's flank, and watched as it bolted back down the road. Disappearing into the night as if fleeing from a fire, he straightened his coat and forced a laugh, though unease was crawling steadily up his spine. The widow led the way up the overgrown path, her long black dress whispering against the weeds. The mansion loomed larger with each step, its roof jagged and broken in places, the wooden siding grey with rot. Vines crept up the stone foundation like veins, and shutters hung at crooked angles, rattling softly even though there was no wind. Caleb felt a prickle at the back of his neck as he mounted the creaking porch. Every board beneath his boots moaned, and for a moment, he had the sense that the house itself was shuddering at his arrival. When the widow opened the door, a stale wave of air drifted out, thick with dust, mildew, and something faintly metallic, like old blood left too long in the sun. The entryway swallowed them in darkness. Only a single oil lamp glowed faintly on a crooked table, casting long shadows across the peeling wallpaper. Portraits lined the hallway, their frames cracked, their faces nearly obscured by age. Yet the figures in them were wrong, too tall, too pale, their eyes painted wider than natural, their hands stretched longer than they should be. Caleb's throat tightened as he passed beneath their watchful gazes. The widow moved silently through the house, her steps making no sound on the warped wooden floors. She did not speak, and Caleb dared not break the silence. His earlier bravado had withered into unease, but his pride forced him to follow deeper into the decaying mansion. The floor groaned beneath his boots. Dust puffed into the air with every step, and somewhere above, a door slammed shut on its own. Caleb's jaw tightened, but he kept walking, forcing himself to ignore the pounding of his heart. They entered a wide parlor, lit only by a few flickering candles. Furniture sat shrouded in white sheets, all yellowed with age. In one corner, a cracked mirror leaned against the wall, its surface warped, bending reflections into grotesque shapes. Caleb caught sight of himself there, his body twisted, his face stretched into a sneer that wasn't his own. He turned quickly away. The widow gestured toward a tall-backed chair, her gloved hand lingering in the candlelight. "Sit," she said in that low, echoing voice. Caleb obeyed, lowering himself into the chair with forced casualness. Though his palms were slick with sweat, the mansion seemed alive, listening, waiting, and the night was only just beginning. The widow moved with a deliberate grace, circling the parlor as if she were measuring Caleb from every angle. The faint candlelight stretched her shadow across the walls, long and distorted, so much so that it seemed to crawl upward toward the ceiling like a living thing. Caleb leaned back in the chair, forcing a smirk onto his face, though his chest was tight with unease. He had expected awkward conversation, maybe nervous laughter, anything but this suffocating silence. Finally, the widow turned to him, her veil tilted just enough to suggest the curve of a pale cheek beneath. "Do you drink, Rancher?" she asked in that deep, echoing tone. Without waiting for an answer, she placed a silver goblet before him, filled with dark red wine that looked almost too thick. Caleb lifted it with hesitation, the cold metal biting into his palm. He sniffed it, then took a shallow sip, expecting sourness, but instead it was sweet, unnaturally so, almost syrupy. The taste clung to his tongue in a way he didn't like, but he swallowed and set the goblet down with a forced chuckle. "Not bad," he said. The widow said nothing in return, only watching him with the stillness of a predator, studying its prey. When she finally moved, it was to glide toward the staircase, her long hand gesturing for him to follow. He hesitated, glancing toward the front door, then back at the veiled figure, disappearing into shadow. The weight of the bet pressed against his pride like a noose, pulling him to his feet. The stairs groaned under his boots as he followed her to the second floor. The hallway stretched unnaturally long, lined with closed doors. Caleb swore some of them had locks on the outside instead of the inside, and he quickened his pace until he reached the room she had entered. The widow stood at the center of what must once have been a grand bedroom. Now, the drapes hung in tatters, moth-eaten and heavy with dust. The only light came from a single candelabrum, its flames quivering, though no wind stirred. The bed dominated the room, tall and old, its carved posts, twisted into shapes that almost resembled faces. If he looked too long, she reached up with deliberate slowness and removed her gloves, placing them neatly on the dresser. Her hands were unnaturally large, the fingers long, the knuckles too pronounced, the skin pale to the point of translucence. Caleb's throat tightened, but he forced a laugh. "Quite a place you've got here," he muttered. She turned toward him, her veil shifting slightly, as though something beneath it had moved. Then she spoke, softer this time, but still carrying that unnatural weight. "Do you want to see me, Rancher? Do you want the truth?" Caleb felt the hair rise on the back of his neck. He had won bets before, drinking contests, horse races, even knife games. But never had the stakes felt like this. His instincts screamed at him to leave, but his pride chained him in place. He smirked, though it trembled at the edges, and spread his arms. "Go on then," he said, his voice too loud for the quiet room. The widow tilted her head slowly, as if amused by his bravado. Her tall frame loomed closer, the candlelight trembling against the veil. Caleb's heartbeat hammered in his chest as she raised both hands to her head, fingers slipping into the curls of her wig. The room was so quiet, Caleb could hear the blood rushing in his ears. The widow's fingers curled into the thick black wig, tugging at its base. At first, he thought she was only teasing him, playing at mystery the way some women did. But then he heard it, the faint rip of stitching, like fabric tearing. The wig shifted unnaturally, and a lock of the glossy black hair fell to the floor with a soft hiss, almost as though it were alive. Caleb's smirk faltered, his throat suddenly dry. He told himself it was just nerves, just the wine, just the flicker of the candles. But a part of him already knew this was no game. With one slow, deliberate pull, she lifted the wig free. What lay beneath froze Caleb where he sat. Her head was bald, not the soft human baldness of age, but a swollen dome of grey, almost waxy flesh, stitched crudely in jagged lines, as if it had been cut open and pieced together again. Veins bulged beneath the skin, pulsing faintly with a rhythm that did not match any heartbeat he'd ever known. Caleb's eyes widened as he saw the scalp glisten, wetly in the candlelight, as though it had never healed. Her face was no better. Where eyebrows should have been, there were only faint scars. And her eyes, God help him, her eyes, were not human. They were round and lidless, two milky orbs that caught the candlelight and seemed to glow faintly from within, like lanterns lit from deep inside her skull. They never blinked, never shifted, only bore into him with a terrible, unrelenting stare. Her lips, cracked and colourless, peeled back into what might have been a smile, though it twisted too wide, showing teeth too sharp at the edges. Caleb's body screamed at him to run, but he couldn't move. It was as though the very sight of her had nailed him to the chair. His breathing grew shallow, his chest tight. The once playful bet had transformed into something grotesque, something beyond comprehension. His mind scrambled for explanations. Illness, deformity, some cruel trick of nature, but none could explain the stitches, the pulsing veins, the inhuman light in her eyes. He realized then why no man had ever lasted with her. Not because of superstition, not because of rumor, but because to see her was to stand on the edge of madness itself. The widow stepped closer, her enormous frame blotting out the flickering light. Her breath cold against his face. "This," she whispered, her voice carrying that deep, unnatural echo, "is who I am when the night is honest." Her fingers, long, pale, and cold as stone, brushed against his cheek. Caleb's heart slammed against his ribs, his body stiff with terror, and though every instinct begged him to scream, to flee, to fight, he could do nothing but sit there, staring into those unblinking eyes that promised he had only seen the beginning. Caleb's muscles locked, every nerve in his body betraying him. It was as if the widow's gaze carried weight, pressing down on his chest until his lungs could draw only shallow, trembling breaths. He wanted to look away, but his eyes refused to break from hers. Her skinless scalp gleamed in the candlelight, veins twitching, as though something beneath them moved of its own accord. She leaned so close that her shadow seemed to swallow his entirely, wrapping him in a darkness that felt alive. "My husband's tried to leave me too," she murmured, her words vibrating through the air like a voice heard underwater. The sound seemed to bypass his ears, digging directly into his skull. Caleb's mind reeled. Flashes of faceless men, lying in shallow graves, clawing through his imagination. He could almost hear the wet drag of shovels, the thud of dirt hitting wooden boxes, the muffled cries of men who had once thought themselves as brave as he. His hand twitched toward his pocket where his knife rested, but his fingers felt numb, heavy, useless. The room itself seemed to shift. The candle flames flickered violently, throwing monstrous shapes across the peeling wallpaper. In the warped mirror by the dresser, Caleb saw a reflection that wasn't his own. A pale, stitched figure slumped in the chair where he sat, eyes wide and glowing like the widow's. He blinked hard, but the image remained, smirking at him with a mouth that stretched too far. Sweat rolled down his temple, cold as ice, and for the first time in his life, Caleb Morton, proud rancher, rich gambler, fearless fool, felt the raw terror of something he could neither buy nor fight. The widow's long hand moved to his chest, her palm pressing firmly over his heart. Her fingers splayed, too wide, too strong, their tips nearly reaching around his ribcage. Caleb gasped at the freezing touch, his pulse pounding beneath her grasp like a trapped bird. "I keep what's mine," she said softly, her smile widening just enough for him to glimpse the sharpness of her teeth. The words were not a threat. They were a promise. Somewhere in the house above them, a door slammed shut, though no one else lived there. Outside, the night stretched silent across the fields. Caleb's horse, miles down the road, neighed in panic, tugging against its tether as though it sensed something unnatural stirring in the mansion. Back inside, Caleb's scream finally tore loose, raw and strangled, echoing off the rotten walls until it seemed to rattle the house itself. But in Dry Creek, no one stirred. By dawn, the only sign of life returning would be his riderless horse, wandering nervously back into town, while the widow, veiled once more, would take her usual seat at the next auction, waiting, silent, patient, for another bet. So remember this, folks. Bets made in pride can cost more than money. Caleb Morton thought he was proving himself a man. Instead, he became just another whisper in the legend of the giant widow. And even now, when the auction bell rings in Dry Creek, some say you can spot her in the back row, sitting tall, silent, veiled, waiting for the next fool brave enough to meet her eyes.
If you liked this video, don't forget to hit that like button, share it with your friends, and drop your thoughts in the comments below. Most importantly, subscribe and hit the bell icon so the next secret finds you first.